In a kingdom found on no map, there lived a fairy queen named Young and Beautiful. It was said that her face glowed more softly than the morning star, and that her hair flowed over her shoulders like golden light. She ruled from the flower castle, which was not a palace at all, but a living garden that awakened with every breath she took. Its rooms were woven from flowering myrtle and white jasmine. Arches of roses bent over the paths, and instead of empty silence, the gentle rustling of leaves drifted through the halls. Her throne was formed from the branches of a weeping willow, and the walls of her chambers were fragrant with thousands of roses that never faded. Even the transparent stairways were covered each morning with fresh dew and tiny blue bellflowers. Spring always reigned within the castle. Yet amid all that flawless beauty, not a single voice truly close to her could be heard. Young and Beautiful had received the gift of eternal youth from her fairy mother. Long ago, her mother had known the bitterness of unrequited love. Hoping to protect her daughter from the same pain, she gave her perfect beauty and the ability to notice only what was lovely in the world. Every evening, music filled the flower castle. Elves danced beneath the arches of roses, nymphs laughed in the gardens, and spirits of the air carried songs from distant meadows. Hundreds of guests admired the queen and praised her every word, but no one dared to draw truly close to her. Her beauty surrounded her with an invisible wall, clear as a crystal cocoon. She was the sun of her kingdom, yet she remained alone within her own radiance. In the midst of every celebration, she had no one with whom she could speak from the heart. More and more often, she dreamed not of further praise, but of a simple, sincere voice beside her, and the warmth of human companionship. One evening, when the music in the flower castle seemed louder than ever, Young and Beautiful realized that she could no longer remain among the endless smiles and admiring glances. Without saying a word to anyone, she took off her radiant gown, hid her hair beneath a plain cloak, and put on a modest gray dress such as a shepherd's daughter might wear. Before dawn, the fairy queen passed through the garden gates and set out for the place where the realm of magic ended. Her path led to a quiet shepherd's valley she had read about in ancient books from the human world. There were no crystal fountains or everlasting spring there, only grass, wind, dusty paths, and scattered lights glowing in cottage windows. She was not searching for adventure. She was seeking simplicity, silence, and a life that was real, hoping that somewhere in the imperfect world she might finally hear her own heart. At dawn, while mist still rested in the hollows, Young and Beautiful saw a young shepherd among the green hills. His name was Alidor. He sat beneath an old ash tree, listening to the murmur of the stream, while his faithful shaggy dog, Varesk, nosed about in the grass beside him. There was nothing simple-minded or timid about Alidor. He carried himself calmly, with such natural dignity that he seemed to need neither wealth nor anyone else's approval. He knew every tree along the shepherd's path, could sense a change in the wind from the movement of the grass, and understood the murmur of water as though it were quiet human speech. He was as unassuming and dependable as the earth beneath his feet. In his silence, Young and Beautiful sensed more wisdom than she had ever heard in the grand speeches of her courtiers. Hidden behind a delicate veil of magic, Young and Beautiful approached the stream. Alador was asleep beneath an old willow, his head resting on his folded cloak. The water moved softly over the stones. The leaves whispered almost inaudibly above him, and Varesk lay at his master's feet, twitching now and then in his sleep. For a long time, the fairy studied the shepherd's peaceful face, his sun-browned skin, and his work-worn hands, marked by earth, rope, and cold water. For the first time, she did not want anyone to admire her beauty. She wished only to sit beside him and understand what filled his thoughts, what brought him joy, what he feared, and what dreams followed him into sleep. For the first time, she wanted to be not the sun that everyone could see, but a gentle breath of wind. And so she decided not to reveal herself to Alador yet. She would remain invisible and come to know his heart before showing him her own. The next morning, Young and Beautiful decided to leave Alador a first sign. While he slept beneath the willow, she touched his plain shepherd's staff with her fingertips. Delicate carved lines immediately spread across the smooth wood. Fern leaves, tiny bellflowers, and branches of wild rose intertwined so skillfully, as though the pattern had been sleeping in the wood for many years. Then the fairy approached the peaceful flock and gently breathed upon the sheep's warm wool. Around the neck of every sheep appeared a delicate garland of fresh, living blossoms, cornflowers, daisies, and clover. The flowers did not bend or fade, but swayed softly with each breath. When Alador awoke, he examined the gift for a long time, then looked at his beautifully adorned flock and smiled. Varesk sniffed the flower garlands, sneezed, and wagged his tail happily. The shepherd was not afraid. He merely told the stream that a kind, invisible spirit had come to live in the valley. The following day, when Alador led his flock toward the distant hills, Young and Beautiful followed him unseen as far as his cottage. She waited until the shepherd disappeared around a bend in the path, then stepped inside. The dwelling was poor but clean. A narrow bed stood against the wall. A wooden cup rested on a shelf, and a neat bundle of kindling lay beside the cold hearth. The fairy placed her palm against the earthen floor, and green shoots immediately began to spread across the room. They rose into lush jasmine bushes, covered with fragrant, star-shaped white blossoms. Beside them grew small trees covered with delicate orange blossoms. By evening, the cottage was filled with the warm fragrance of jasmine and orange blossom. When Alador returned home, he stopped on the threshold. His humble dwelling had become a fragrant garden. She had given him not gold, but a scent that warmed the very soul of his home. Alador admired the wonders, but did not allow them to blind him. He understood that the flower garlands, the carved staff, and the fragrant garden had not appeared at the whim of some carefree spirit. Behind every gift, he sensed someone's quiet kindness and thoughtful purpose. The next morning, Varesk ran out to meet his master. The following words had been embroidered in silver thread on his old leather collar. Beauty can lead you only to the threshold of the heart, but only devotion can remain within it. Alador slowly read the inscription again. Now he was certain that the mysterious stranger was not only kind and powerful, but wise. For the first time, she had spoken to him, not with her voice, but through a truth entrusted to a faithful dog. The shepherd stroked Varesk and said quietly, "I would like to meet the one who left these words." The invisible fairy heard him, and her heart trembled. That evening, when Alador returned from the hills, a magnificent feast for two awaited him on his plain table. Golden brown roasted quail glistened on the platters. Sweet fruit lay beside them, and aromatic wine shimmered in a pitcher. Hidden from sight, Young and Beautiful watched the shepherd. This was her final and most important test. Alador was hungry, but he did not touch the feast. He smiled and spoke into the silence. "Thank you, kind spirit. But such a feast is not meant for one person alone." He went out to the path and called his neighbours, the poor shepherds who lived in the nearby cottages. Soon the table was crowded. Cups passed from hand to hand, and the little house filled with laughter and grateful voices. Alador shared the wondrous gift so naturally that it seemed he could not have acted otherwise. And the invisible queen understood that a true knight stood before her, though he had never held a sword. When Young and Beautiful saw Alador share the enchanted feast with his neighbours, she knew that she no longer wished to hide from him. Yet she did not dare appear in all her royal radiance. It was too easy to bow before a fairy, and far more difficult to see the living heart behind the magic. And so she removed her crown, dimmed the light around her, and took the form of a simple shepherdess. She wore a modest linen dress with white daisies and blue cornflowers woven into her hair. That evening, the valley celebrated the end of the harvest. Bagpipes played in the village square. Young shepherds whirled in the dance, and children laughed beside the long tables. Young and Beautiful came with everyone else, but remained at the edge of the gathering. Accustomed to being revered, she now felt shy as an ordinary young woman. As she waited for Alador, she feared for the first time that his heart might fail to recognize her. Alador noticed her almost at once. Among the bright ribbons and laughing faces, she stood quietly, like a wildflower beside a busy road. He did not recognize the fairy queen, but he felt an inexplicable warmth drawing him toward her. A little embarrassed, he approached. "Would you dance with me?" he asked. Young and Beautiful smiled and placed her hand in his. It was no stately court minuet. The bagpipes played quickly. Heels beat out the rhythm, skirts spun, and true, irrepressible laughter rang all around them. Alador laughed with everyone else, and before long, she began to laugh as well. For the first time, she was touched not with reverence, but with simple joy. For the first time, no one bowed before her. People were simply glad that she was there. And in that cheerful dance, she felt neither like an enchantress nor a queen, but simply like a happy young woman. For several days, Young and Beautiful returned to the valley in the form of a shepherdess. She and Alador walked along the stream and spoke for hours beneath the old willow. And with each evening, their feelings grew stronger. He fell in love with the simple young woman he believed her to be, never suspecting who she truly was. At last, the fairy realized that she no longer had the right to hide the truth. She led Alador to the same meadow where she had first seen him sleeping. There, her linen dress flared with gentle light and transformed into radiant robes, while the power of a queen rang in her voice. "I am the fairy queen," she said. "All the wonders in the valley were my doing." She expected fear, but Alador looked into her eyes with the same love as before. "You are still the same," he answered quietly. With a relieved smile, she invited him to the flower castle. When Alador entered the flower castle, he felt as though he had stepped into spring itself. The walls of the rooms were woven from myrtle, jasmine, and roses, and every petal seemed to breathe softly, filling the air with a sweet, fresh fragrance. Soft moss yielded beneath his feet, and leaves rustled in the green arches above him. Beyond them lay enormous greenhouses. Beneath transparent crystal domes, warm summer rain fell throughout the year. Drops tapped softly against broad leaves, ran down the stems, and blended into a steady, soothing music. But Alador was most astonished by the Hall of Daffodils. At its center flowed a silver fountain whose water reflected no faces. When the shepherd looked into it, he saw the warmth of his mother's hands, the first lamb he had ever led to pasture, and the day when Varesk, still a puppy, had chosen him as his master. He understood that he had entered not merely a castle, but the very heart of her dream, where everything bright and good had been carefully preserved. Young and Beautiful led Alador from hall to hall, proudly showing him singing fountains, living walls, and flowers that opened at her slightest glance. She expected the admiration she was accustomed to, But the shepherd did not gasp at the marvels, or question her about the secrets of magic. He was not looking at the radiant arches. He was looking at her. Behind her smile and confident gestures, Alador noticed a familiar shadow in her eyes. A quiet sadness none of her countless guests had ever noticed. When they were alone, beside the fountain of memories, he gently took her hand. "Tell me, my queen, are you ever lonely amid all this eternal beauty?" Young and Beautiful grew still. Among all the wonders of her castle, he was the first to see not a powerful fairy, but her lonely soul. Alador's question touched Young and Beautiful more deeply than any wonder ever had. For hundreds of years, people had asked her about the mysteries of magic, eternal youth, and the power of flowers and fountains. But no one had ever asked whether she sometimes suffered. She looked at the shepherd for a long time, and for the first time, tears shone in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from relief. "Yes, my dear friend," she answered softly. "Sometimes." That simple admission broke the invisible wall that had surrounded her heart for so many years. Young and Beautiful understood that Alador saw her not as a queen or an immortal fairy, but as a living soul. And he understood that even great power could not protect someone from loneliness. And so love was born between them, quiet, deep, and true. And the word "sometimes" became more meaningful than the grandest vows. But from a distant palace, the fairy Mordecai watched their happiness. Once she too had loved and been loved. Yet her fear of losing someone she loved had proven stronger than her trust. With magic, Mordecai stopped time throughout her kingdom, hoping to preserve love forever, exactly as it had been on the happiest day of her life. Her garden remained flawlessly beautiful, but the birds never sang, the leaves never fell, and the water in the fountains hung motionless like silver threads. Everything was frozen in perfect, lifeless order. As Mordecai watched Young and Beautiful beside Alador, she felt more than simple envy. To her, entrusting an immortal heart to a vulnerable mortal seemed reckless. She was certain that she was protecting the young fairy from inevitable pain. And so she decided to prove that Alador could not be trusted before their living love could destroy one of them. One warm summer evening, Young and Beautiful went down to the river with Alador. Their light boat glided slowly between the banks, where white water lilies gleamed in the twilight, and long grasses swayed gently. Alador dipped the oars into the water in a steady rhythm. Each dip of the oars sent soft circles spreading across the water, mingling with the chirping of crickets and the faint rustle of reeds. The air was filled with the coolness of the river and the sweet fragrance of blooming lilies. They spoke very little, There was no need for words. Young and Beautiful sat beside him, her shoulder resting lightly against his arm, while Alador watched the sunset colour the water in shades of gold and rose. Their boat glided over the river as though across a peaceful mirror. The silence between them was so full of happiness that it seemed nothing in the world could disturb it. When the sun disappeared behind the distant gardens and twilight slowly settled over the river, Mordecai began to act. She summoned no storm, no black birds, and no frightening creatures. Instead, a thick silver mist rose from the water. It was cool and smelled of mint, damp grass, and something sweet, like a forgotten dream. The mist silently enveloped the boat, hid the riverbanks, dimmed the reflections of the stars, and erased the distant lights of the flower castle. There was nothing threatening in its touch. On the contrary, the mist gently lulled Alador to sleep like a soft lullaby. Alador felt his eyelids grow heavy and his thoughts become slow, soft, and strangely pleasant. He tried to call her name, but the words dissolved on his lips. A moment later, his head slumped to one side, and he fell asleep without noticing that the mist had begun to carry the boat away into the unknown darkness. Young and Beautiful did not surrender to the sleeping spell. She knew at once that something was wrong when Alador dropped the oar and his head slumped helplessly to one side. "Alador, wake up," she called, touching his face, but he did not answer. His breathing remained steady, as though he was sleeping more peacefully than ever. Meanwhile, an unseen current caught the boat. It slowly turned toward the shore and slipped soundlessly into a dense thicket of reeds. The fairy reached out, trying to hold on to Alador, but the silver mist thickened between them like a cold curtain. When it cleared, Young and Beautiful was alone in the middle of the dark river. Both the boat and Alador were gone. "Alador," she called again. Only the soft lapping of water answered her. The mist had vanished, but it had taken the peace and stillness of her heart with it. Alador awoke not in a dungeon, but in a bright room where everything seemed designed for rest. Silvery curtains barely stirred. The fountains whispered instead of murmuring, and distant music played so softly that it seemed afraid to disturb his sleep. This was the palace of quiet desires, Mordecai's domain. There were no vivid colours, intense fragrances, or unsettling sounds. Everything was flawless, gentle, and strangely lifeless. The mistress of the palace appeared before Alador. She did not threaten him. Mordecai offered him immeasurable wealth so that he could shower his loved ones with gold, the glory of a great general, and eternal life without illness, loss, or fear. "Forget this love, with all its trials," she said. "Here, you will never feel pain again, and every new day will be like a beautiful dream." She offered him a harbour without storms, leaving only one thing unsaid. Ships that entered this harbour dropped anchor forever and never set sail upon the sea of life again. The next morning, Mordecai returned to Alidor's bright chamber. With a wave of her hand, the walls dissolved, revealing golden palaces, banners of victory, and public squares where thousands of voices praised his name. But Alidor regarded the visions calmly. He had not slept all night, remembering Young and Beautiful's quiet laughter, the warmth of her hand, and their evening on the river. Beside those memories, wealth and glory seemed no more substantial than dust. "I am grateful for your hospitality, my lady," he said. "But all the treasures in the world are not worth one of her smiles. I ask only one thing. Allow me to see Young and Beautiful." Mordecai frowned, but decided that this was merely the first sign of stubbornness. Yet the following morning, Alidor repeated the same words, and the following day, he said them again. Each new day began with the same quiet, unwavering refusal. Meanwhile, Young and Beautiful returned to the flower castle, and almost immediately recognized the magic that had summoned the silver mist. Mordecai had abducted Alidor. Her first impulse was to gather all the power of spring, summon the winds, roots, and living waters, and unleash them upon the palace of quiet desires, until not one stone stood upon another. But her anger faded as quickly as it had flared. In Mordecai's frozen gardens lived innocent nymphs, birds, and garden spirits. They served their mistress not out of cruelty, but because they were bound by the ancient laws of magic. If war began, they would be the first to suffer. And so Young and Beautiful chose another path, one slower and more difficult. She decided to trust Alidor, support him from afar with silent signs, and send him the strength of her love every morning, while keeping her own realm bright. She could have answered blow for blow, but instead chose the quiet, unwavering light of patience. Waiting did not make Young and Beautiful a prisoner of sorrow. She continued to protect the light of the flower castle, restoring life to wilted petals, awakening the fountains, and opening the windows to the sun each morning. Then she returned to Alidor's valley. Her hands healed sick sheep. Her quiet song passed over the fields, and the bread dough rose better than ever before. She cared for the shepherd's elderly father and his neighbours as though looking after them were another thread that bound her to the man she loved. Every evening, the fairy climbed to the highest tower. She did not weep, but whispered words of hope and devotion to the wind. Not one day of separation made her doubt him. "Find him," she pleaded. "Tell him that I am waiting for him." Her messages flew across the world like invisible birds, searching for the one window behind which the man her heart longed for was being held. Her evening messages were heard by Zephyr, the powerful guardian of the spring wind. He too had once been captivated by Young and Beautiful's loveliness, and had dreamed that one day she might choose him. But as he watched her wait faithfully for a mortal shepherd and care for the shepherd's home, Zephyr understood for the first time the difference between wanting someone all to oneself and a love that values the other person's happiness above its own desires. One evening, the wind gathered at the top of the tower and took the form of a radiant human figure. Zephyr bowed before the Fairy Queen, but no longer as an admirer. "I am no longer your rival," he said. "I wish to be your faithful friend. Allow me to help you." He spread his transparent wings and promised to carry her all the way to the Palace of Quiet Desires, a place to which no earthly road led. And so the wind, that had once admired her beauty, became a knight in the service of her love. Young and Beautiful accepted Zephyr's help with gratitude. He surrounded her with the cool breath of the spring wind and carried her aloft on his invisible wings. They rose above the towers of the flower castle and flew smoothly, almost soundlessly, like an autumn leaf drifting slowly through clear air. Beneath them passed dark forests, golden fields, silver rivers, and mountains whose peaks touched the clouds. The Fairy Queen looked down at the world with wonder and quiet sadness. Long ago, she had shut herself away in eternal spring and had nearly forgotten how vast the world was beyond the walls of her beautiful solitude. Now every breath of wind carried her closer to Alador. Somewhere ahead, beyond distant mountains and Mordika's enchantments, the Palace of Quiet Desires lay hidden. For her, the flight was both a farewell to loneliness and an encounter with hope. The journey to the Palace of Quiet Desires was long, but Young and Beautiful did not keep her eyes fixed only on what lay ahead. From high above, she noticed every sorrow on the earth below. One region was covered with scorched fields. The fairy raised her hands, and warm rain fell upon the dry earth. The drops rustled softly over the dusty leaves, and the grass immediately lifted towards the life-giving rain. Farther on, they saw young birds that had been left behind by their flock. At her request, Zephyr lifted them on a gentle current of air and guided them back to their nests. Near a village, where even the evening light seemed sorrowful, the fairy dropped a single golden seed. By morning, it had grown into a tree bearing silver fruit, and everyone who touched its bark remembered their own hope. And so her path to the man she loved became a path of kindness. Young and Beautiful's heart was so full of love that she could not help sharing it with the world. Meanwhile, in the Palace of Quiet Desires, after rejecting every gift Mordika had offered him, Alador entered the final chamber. Its walls were covered with thousands of mirrors, and each one showed him a different life. In one mirror, he saw himself as a wealthy merchant whose caravans crossed golden deserts and whose chests overflowed with rare jewels. In another, Alador appeared as a great commander before whom kings bowed and trumpets of triumph rang out before him. A third mirror promised him immortality and the wisdom to uncover every secret of the earth and stars. These lives were flawless. They held no poverty, worry, old age, or loss. Honor, peace, and admiration surrounded him. Alador slowly moved from mirror to mirror. Each mirror offered him a destiny that seemed perfect in every detail. But in none of them did he find young and beautiful's voice, her smile, or the warmth of her hand. Alador stopped in the center of the mirrored hall. Thousands of perfect destinies gleamed around him, yet his heart remained unmoved. Young and beautiful appeared in none of the reflections. Nowhere did he hear her quiet laughter, see her concerned gaze, or feel the warmth of her hand. Then he turned away from the mirrors and spoke loudly, knowing that Mordecai heard every word. Love must never imprison anyone. It does not have to be comfortable or easy. Sometimes it brings pain and longing, but without that living love, however painful and full of trials it might be, I have no need of any of your flawless, but lifeless destinies. His voice rolled through the hall, and the mirrors trembled. Yet it was not the glass that cracked. The enchantment holding Alador captive broke apart. Silver chains of light vanished. The doors flew open. And for the first time, the motionless air of the palace stirred. And so his word of devotion proved stronger than all of Mordecai's illusions. At the very moment Alador made his choice, a mighty spring wind rose above the palace. Zephyr struck with his invisible wings, and windows that had been sealed for decades flew open, one after another, with a loud ringing sound. Sunlight poured into the motionless halls. It lay in golden bands across the pale walls, awakened the sleeping fountains, and made the silver curtains tremble. With the wind came birdsong, the scent of damp earth, and the fragrance of living blossoms. Doors opened, still water began to murmur again, and for the first time, the music sounded freely and clearly. The magic of stagnation and oblivion broke apart like thin ice beneath warm sunlight. It seemed that the entire palace of quiet desires took its first deep breath in many years and remembered what it meant to be alive. Young and beautiful appeared in the open doorway of the mirrored hall. But she wore neither her radiant crown nor robes woven from light. She entered wearing the same simple linen dress she had worn in the guise of a shepherdess, with daisies and cornflowers in her hair, that Alador had seen at the celebration in the valley. The fairy queen had left her splendor beyond the threshold. She knew that Alador had not fallen in love with her power, her immortality, or her enchanted castle. He had fallen in love with the young woman who laughed with him during the village dance, and had placed her hand in his with complete trust. She looked at him tenderly, with no reproach for their long separation, and simply smiled. Alador stepped toward her. At that moment, he understood that the greatest gift was not her return, but that she had come to him just as she had been when he first fell in love with her. They walked slowly toward one another through the hall, where the mirrors, newly freed from Mordika's enchantment, were still trembling. Neither Alador nor Young and Beautiful spoke any grand words. Everything that mattered most had already been expressed through their actions. Alador extended his hand, and she placed her palm in his. He had remained faithful, rejecting wealth, glory, immortality, and effortless peace. She had kept her faith in him, refusing to let her anger destroy a world that was not her own, waiting patiently and sending her love to him through the wind. Their trial was over. The separation had not weakened their feelings, but had freed them from fear and doubt. The simple touch of their hands held more meaning than all the promises made by the Palace of Quiet Desires. It marked the end of two lonely roads, and the beginning of a single path they would share. Mordika quietly entered the hall. Sunlight lay in golden bands across the floor. The open windows admitted the songs of birds, and Alador and Young and Beautiful stood together, still holding hands. Mordika did not grow angry. She looked at them for a long time, and a deep, weary sadness appeared on her face. "I was so afraid of losing love that I turned it to stone and imprisoned it in changeless order," she said. "But you have shown me that true love is not a cage, but a flight. I tried to test your feelings with fear and temptation, but true love reveals itself only through trust." Beyond the open windows, the frozen branches began to move, and for the first time, leaves fell from them. Mordika understood that her flawless garden had not been a fortress protecting love, but the tomb of the very love she had tried to preserve. She bowed her head before the lovers, not defeated, but freed by their example. Young and Beautiful listened until Mordika had finished. No anger remained in her heart, nor any desire for revenge over their separation. She approached Mordika, not as a victor approaching the defeated, but as a healer approaching a soul that had lived too long in motionless silence. From the folds of her simple dress, the fairy took several small, glowing seeds. They rested upon her palm, like tiny stars holding the warmth of spring earth. "Your garden froze because there was no hope within it," she said gently. "Plant these seeds and let a new, living garden grow from them. Then you will no longer have to hold anyone beside you with enchantments. Those who find warmth near you will choose to remain. Mordecai accepted the seeds with trembling hands. They were more than a gift of forgiveness. They were a quiet promise of a new beginning. Leaving Mordecai with her glowing seeds and newfound hope, Alador and Young and Beautiful departed from the Palace of Quiet Desires. They could have returned to the Flower Castle, where eternal spring, music, and hundreds of servants awaited them. But they chose another road. They walked back to the valley on foot, holding hands like ordinary travelers. Grass rustled beneath their feet. Clouds drifted above the hills. And ahead of them, they could already hear Varesk's familiar bark. Alador did not wish for immortality. Young and Beautiful gave him what he truly desired: a long, peaceful human life beside the woman he loved. And though she remained an immortal fairy, she chose to share every simple day with him: the morning bread, the tending of the flock, the evening fire, and their quiet conversations. She chose not a palace, but a home. Not an eternity without change, but a love that was alive. Alador and Young and Beautiful settled in Alador's old cottage. Magic did not transform it into a palace. The walls remained wooden. Firewood still lay stacked beside the hearth, and grass whispered beyond the windows. But the house grew brighter. Jasmine bloomed on the windowsills, and each evening carried the fragrance of bread, honey, and warm milk. The flower castle did not disappear either. By the fairy's command, its gates were never closed again. Weary travelers, lost children, and anyone in need of warmth, silence, and a kind word could find shelter there. The sheep grazed peacefully in the valley, while shaggy Varesk raced happily among them. Sometimes in the evenings, Alador and his beloved walked to the castle. In the Hall of Daffodils, they sat beside the fountain and looked together upon their happiest memories. They did not hide their happiness away, but made it an open door for others. And so they came to rule their little kingdom of flowering valleys, not with noise or authority, but quietly and wisely. Their doors remained open, their fields stayed green, and their evenings were filled with light and kind conversation. The years passed. Silver strands gradually appeared in Alador's hair. Fine lines formed around his eyes, and his steps grew slower. Young and Beautiful remained as youthful as she had been on the day they first met. But her eternal youth was no longer a curse of loneliness. She did not fear time or try to hold it still. Each new day beside Alador allowed her to discover a new kind of beauty in him: patience, wisdom, gentleness, and quiet strength. And then she understood that eternal youth was not a gift received at birth. but the art of seeing beauty anew each day in the person one loves.